This is for Introduction to Music, and this is the lecture for Part 6 from the KMEN, Music and Appreciation, Chapter 20, which is titled Music for Stage and Screen. So we're going to start with music for stage, and that means starting with musical theater. Specifically, what we think of today, what we refer to as a Broadway musical, because in America that is the heart of musical theater. So a musical is theater that uses, of course, a script and acting, spoken dialogue, but music, singing, dancing, scenery, costumes. It's very similar to opera in many ways, and many people view opera as kind of the height of all art forms, because every art form that there is you can find in here. The written word through script, acting, spoken dialogue, so more acting, music, instrumental music, vocal music, dancing, even the visual arts, because you've got scenery that you have to create, and you've got costuming. So it's a fusion of all these other art forms. In America, of course, as I said, Broadway is the heart of all these musicals. It's where all the biggest musicals go, but they also tour. You can find productions of musicals everywhere. Here at Delaware State, we have a musical production every year. Most recently, I believe it was Beauty and the Beast. So, and then of course there are movie versions of these musicals as well. Some of these, sometimes they make a movie musical, like La La Land is a good example of that, which I think just won a bunch of Oscars last year. That was a movie musical. I'm fairly sure that they're going to develop a stage version of the movie musical moving forward. Anytime something's that popular. Mamma Mia, I think, was originally a movie that they then turned into a stage musical. So, musicals. Generally speaking, they are in 2 acts. The first act is longer, and then there's an intermission, and the second act is shorter. While there are similarities to opera, there are differences as well. The music tends to be much more complicated in opera. Musicals tend to have simpler harmonies, more straightforward structure in the songs, stuff that's more easily singable, not from the performer's perspective, who are, in Broadway they're certainly professionals who could sing anything, but from the perspective of the audience. They want you walking out of the theater humming or whistling the songs. Also, musicals involve spoken dialogue, whereas opera does not have any spoken dialogue. Everything is sung in opera. So there's also a variety of styles of these musicals. A lot of the traditional musicals that we think of that came out of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, these very famous musicals like Showboat and West Side Story and Oklahoma and Annie Get Your Gun and all of these musicals, Cabaret, well, Cabaret was 70s. These musicals were big hits when they were running, and then they're still running to this day. You can find production, you can probably find a production of Oklahoma going on right now somewhere, probably many productions of Oklahoma happening somewhere in North America right now. So you've got this kind of more classical, symphonic style of musical, like, say, Phantom of the Opera. You've got more jazzy musicals, like Anything Goes, that the great jazz musician Cole Porter wrote the music for that. You've got rock musicals, like Rent. You've got more Latin-sounding musicals. You've got musicals that have complete plots. You have jukebox musicals. We'll get into the difference between that in just a moment. So, where did the musical come from? Because it's really only been around for about 100 years. Its roots are in operetta. Operetta was a light opera. It was an opera, but it's actually much more similar to a modern musical in many ways than it was to an opera. There were songs, but there was also spoken dialogue, and there were dance numbers. But the music tends to be more sophisticated than most musicals, so it kind of bridges opera to the musical. The most famous composers of operetta were a couple of gentlemen named Gilbert and Sullivan. They were English, and they wrote many operettas, The Mikado, HMS Pinafore, the Pirates of Penzance, huge hits that are still performed all over the world today, well over 100 years later. Now in America, we had a series of shows, very popular in the 1800s, called vaudeville. Vaudeville would combine all sorts of acts, a real variety of different acts. Singing acts, comedy, acrobatic acts, juggling, animal acts like trained dogs and things like that. And so you've got this kind of spectacle and all these different things happening. And then when you combine that with operetta, it kind of fused into the earliest musicals. Now, the most important musicals in the early, say the first half of the life of musicals, Showboat. Showboat in 1927 was a musical that was quite serious. It didn't have this lighthearted feel that many musicals have. It actually had an interracial romance, and it was the first interracial chorus to appear on stage. This was in 1927, when the United States was still an extraordinarily segregated place. So Showboat broke a lot of boundaries. Of Thee I Sing, which was a musical produced in 1931, made fun of presidential elections, and was actually one of the first times that a musical kind of tried to be topical and take shots at things that were happening in politics. Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma came out in 1943, and as I said, this is one of these shows that's still on today. This was one of the first big dance musicals, where they actually had giant chorus dance numbers in addition to solo dance numbers, and the dance was used to advance the plot as well as the spoken dialogue. That's very different. 1957, West Side Story by maybe the most important American musician of the last 100 years, Leonard Bernstein, takes place in New York City in Hell's Kitchen, and it's about gang warfare. It's about a gang of a Puerto Rican gang and an American gang, the Jets and the Sharks, and they're going to fight. It's a retelling, actually, of Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet, you've got the two families that have hated each other and have fought each other, the Montagues and the Capulets, but you got Romeo in one family, Juliet in the other family, and they fall in love, and it ends tragically. Well, that's West Side Story. You've got the Jets and the Sharks, and you've got Tony and Maria. Tony's the leader of one gang, Maria is the sister of the leader of the other gang, and they fall in love, but it's Romeo and Juliet, so you know people are going to die at the end. After 1960, the popularity of rock music really started to change the landscape of musicals a great deal. While some people still wrote traditional sounding musicals with big pit orchestras and music that was more rooted in classical music and jazz, the rock musical starts to break in. In the 1960s and 70s, we have the musical Hair, which was all about the summer of love, the hippie movement. Hair because, you know, everyone would grow their hair really long, really big. And it actually had a completely nude scene on stage, which really made it a lot of talk about that. Jesus Christ Superstar is a fascinating musical. That's a fairly early Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. Obviously a retelling of the New Testament, but it's also a rock musical. Now, the musical was an American development. As we think of the musical today, it was an American invention, and all the great musical composers up through the 60s really were Americans. We started to see, however, foreign composers start to become really big. In the 1970s, Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's British, who wrote Cats and wrote Phantom of the Opera, among many other musicals, well, he's probably the biggest musical composer of the last 20 or 30 years. Also, Les Miserables, or Les Mis, is based on a French book, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And Miss Saigon is actually a retelling of an opera called Madame Butterfly, which was written by an Italian, Puccini, and it takes place in Vietnam. So when we get into the 70s and 80s, we start to see the American musical become subject to many more influences by writers from other countries as well as influences from other countries. So where do musicals come from? I was just talking about this the other day. Right now I'm playing a production, I'm playing in the pit orchestra for production of The Addams Family. And my thought always is, boy, they'll make anything into a musical. And they will. Musicals have been made out of animated films. Now, a lot of these animated films were originally musicals in the first place. But Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King, both incredibly popular musicals that were originally animated films. Literary influences, Les Mis, as I said, but also the book Wicked. That was originally a book that they turned into a musical. Dance musicals. Dance musicals are musicals that exist mainly for the big dance scenes. Riverdance was a musical based entirely around traditional Irish dancing, and Billy Elliot was a musical about a kid who wanted to be a dancer. He was a little English kid, and he wanted to be a dancer. So these are musicals that the plot exists primarily just so you can have big dance scenes. Which leads us to jukebox musicals. A jukebox musical is a musical that features all music by a popular band of some sort, or in some cases, a genre. So Mamma Mia is probably the most famous jukebox musical because they created this musical all around the music of the 1970s band ABBA. And so basically, someone had to just sit down and write a plot. And the only point of the plot was, we need to have a way to get from point A to point B to point C to point D where they're singing all these ABBA songs. So we need to figure out a way to construct a plot that exists solely for the singing of these songs. So it's not like Les Mis, that is initially about the story, and now we're going to write songs. Instead, it's all about the songs, and we're going to write a story, just so we can sing the songs. Rock musicals, as I said, Hair and Rent. Rent, by the way, is another musical. It was originally, an opera was written over 100 years ago by Puccini again, the same guy who wrote Madame Butterfly, that they updated and turned into the musical Miss Saigon. Madame Butterfly was about a serviceman, a naval officer, who goes to Japan, and he falls in love with a woman. She falls in love with him. Of course, her family doesn't want them to be together because it's very traditional, plus he's a naval officer, he's going to go away. But eventually he has to leave. So Miss Saigon was an updated version of that took place in Vietnam in the 1970s with an American soldier and a Vietnamese girl. So, sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. Rent, the original opera written over 100 years ago by Puccini again, was called La Bohème, and it's about, it was supposed to take place in Paris in the 1850s, and a bunch of poor, young, artistic types who are living in nasty apartments with a terrible landlord, and, you know, trying to be young and carefree and make their art. And Rodolfo, poet, falls in love with Mimi, a seamstress, and she dies of tuberculosis. Update that from Paris in the 1850s to New York in the 1980s, replace tuberculosis with AIDS, and you have the musical Rent. And then pop culture musicals. They made a musical out of Spider-Man. They made a musical out of the Book of Mormon. That was the guys, South Park guys, did the Book of Mormon. As I said, I'm playing a musical right now based on the Addams Family, which was originally a comic that was turned into a TV show back in the 1960s, and then they made some movies about it. So you can pretty much make a musical out of anything as long as you've got good songs. If it's got good songs, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be a popular musical. I mentioned Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein might be the most important American musician that's ever lived, some people would argue. He was born in 1918, died in 1990 when I was in college. I remember when Bernstein died. He was born in Massachusetts. He went to Harvard, studied music. He was a conductor. He was a conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He was an educator. He was a pianist, played piano. He wrote classical music, orchestra music, and vocal music. He also wrote musicals. He wrote books. He lectured. He was an incredible force for music in this country. He probably in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s exposed more people to music than anyone. Classical music, but also through his musicals like West Side Story and his operetta Candide. When he was 25 years old, only 25 years old, he became the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, which is basically like being CEO of a major company. It usually doesn't go to people nearly that young. His music was classical, but it also had a lot of jazz influences in it, and a lot of popular influences in it. So his music is utterly fantastic. So, on Blackboard, in addition to this lecture, I'll also be linking to some videos. And one of the videos is going to be of the Tonight Ensemble from the movie version of the musical Romeo and Juliet. It's really an interesting piece of music because it involves solo singing, but also involves ensemble singing. It's got Latin in it, it's got jazz in it, bebop jazz in it, it's got classical elements in it. It involves, here's this word that we got to fish out from all the way back in Unit 1, non-imitative polyphony, where you've got, here's a melody, here's a completely different melody, now we're going to bring them together and have it all happen at the same time. So it's levels of musical complexity within the structure of a musical. So I'll be posting a video of the Tonight Ensemble for you to watch on Blackboard. Okay, so that's just a very, very brief overview of musicals. Musicals are still undeniably popular today. Broadway sells out. They're performed all over the world. Probably the second biggest place where musicals are performed is in London. It's called the West End in London. If you're performing in a West End show in London, it's just like you're performing on Broadway in America. And schools, high schools, middle schools, colleges do productions. Community groups do productions. So musicals are almost omnipresent. You know, in the state of Delaware this spring, there are going to be several dozen musicals performed, from high school performances up through large touring companies. Movie music. I would dare say that more people are exposed to classical sounding music through the movies than any other medium today. We start out with the era of silent movies. The first 30, 35 years of movies, there was no way to put sound on film. So the movies were actually completely silent. The actors would act, they would pantomime, and then the dialogue would be flashed up on screen, because there was also no way to close caption. There was no technology for subtitles or anything. So they would act, and then the next thing they would show the dialogue up on the screen, and then they would, like this. It would look like a slide that just had what they had just said on it, and then they'd go on to the next thing. But the music, while there was no music or dialogue on the film, they did provide music. One way they provided music was they had live musicians who would, when the movie was being shown, the live musicians would sit there and they would supply music. The music, of course, helped enhance the mood of the film. Also, the projectors were very noisy, so the music would help drown out the sound of the projector. Oh, I've seen this. This is an actor named Charlie Chaplin. Absolutely far and away the most famous star of the silent film era. Robert Downey Jr., the guy who plays Iron Man, back fairly early in his career, he actually did a biopic about Charlie Chaplin, which is a great movie, and you should check it out. It really marked Robert. He may have been nominated for an Academy Award for that. He was very young. He was in his early 20s when he did that, and that kind of marked Robert Downey Jr. as a great actor who was to be reckoned with. Something that would happen is the music was almost always supplied by a piano player. Someone would sit there at the piano supplying the music, and they would improvise. Sometimes they would make up music, or you could get music and figure, and like this is titled Sinister Theme. If something's happening, if there's something dangerous about to happen, the piano player would play this thing, Sinister Theme. Hurry music for struggles. If there was some action happening on stage, they might play that. So the piano player would have all sorts of music that they would sit down and say, okay, on this scene I'm going to play this love song, and for this scene I'm going to play this hurry music, and for this scene I'm going to play this presto for sword fights or whatever. So they would have it planned out and have the music all set up, so they would play. Sometimes they would and did improvise, but sometimes they would play pre-prepared music. So 1929 is when they invented recording sound onto film. So we now had dialogue possible, which also had the unintended effect of some famous silent film actors no longer were famous actors, because when it went from silent acting to having your voice recorded, well, I mean, some of them just didn't have a good voice for movies necessarily, or they couldn't get the hang of it. So some people that were famous actors in the silent film era just kind of vanished after 1929. So not only the dialogue, but now they can start recording music onto film. This is when movie music started to become a thing. Up until the 1950s, all the different movie studios, MGM and 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers, they all had their own full symphony orchestra. So full symphony orchestra on their staff. if you lived in Los Angeles and you worked for MGM, if I was a trombone player and I worked for MGM, that meant that every time MGM brought in a movie and they needed music, I played. I had full-time employment recording music for them. Eventually that changed to this freelance model where all the different studios, they don't have their own specific symphony orchestras. Instead, they hire musicians. Okay, we're doing music for the newest Star Wars movie, and it requires this many musicians, so we're going to go out, we're going to hire those many musicians. It's called being a freelance musician. And it can be a very lucrative life if you're one of the top call freelance musicians and you're called for all these movies. So these days, well, I mean, really since the 1930s, most of the time, a soundtrack is composed specifically for that movie. They do the script, they shoot the movie, and then they hire a composer, and the composer writes music specifically for that movie. Although some movies, instead of writing original music, they use pre-existing music already because that music already fits the mood of the movie. Or sometimes they do a mix where they'll have some pre-existing songs or music already in the movie, and then they'll write some original music for other scenes. So why is music important in a film? A lot of different reasons, really. Momentum and continuity. Music can link together ideas and scenes. It can keep the action moving forward when things on stage seem fairly stoic. It can suggest a mood. There's an old story about they shot a movie, and at the end of the movie there was a final scene where a guy walks up to the front door. There's this woman, and they've been together, and now they're not together anymore, and he walks up and he knocks on her door, and she opens the door, and then she just closes it, and he walks off. And I think it's raining. And when they first did the test screening of this, the audience laughed. It was supposed to be a very sad scene, but the audience laughed. So they had the composer, they wrote the music, and for this scene he wrote very sad music. And so the guy walks up to the door, knocks, she opens the door, she just turns around, closes the door, and leaves. He walks off, sad music in the background, and everyone knows, oh, this is sad. And so they were sad instead of laughing at the scene. So music can have a huge effect on the personality of a movie, on what you're supposed to be feeling. Now this is a technique we're going to talk about when we just start talking about opera in a few weeks. It's called a leitmotif. A leitmotif is basically a theme, a melody that is identified with a specific character or place or idea. This started back in the 1800s in classical music with a guy named Hector Berlioz, and then Richard Wagner, a great German opera composer, really developed the idea to its full extent. Other composers like Puccini, who I've mentioned, Italian opera composer, used the idea of leitmotifs. Well, movies utilize this idea all the time. In the movie Jaws, there's this theme that represents the shark. In Star Wars, the Imperial March, every time you hear that, you know it's about Darth Vader in the Empire. In James Bond, there's that specific that James Bond theme. Harry Potter, that initial theme is actually called Hedwig's theme, and every time Hedwig would fly through the screen or something like that, you'd hear it. So I'll see if I can put together some video clips and post them on the Blackboard page of examples of some of these themes. I'm definitely going to put up some videos giving examples of movie music being recorded and some really cool shots from studio, some little short, like 2-minute documentary scenes and stuff like that. So some films use popular music, either pre-existing popular music or new music that's written sounding popular style. A movie like Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill is a good example of that. Other movies use orchestra, straight up classical sounding music like Star Wars and Harry Potter. And other movies, like The Matrix, use this very electronic sounding music. Makes sense, it fits the style of the movie, 100%. So what's happening here, and like I said, I'll post a couple videos where you can see this, this is the conductor who is leading the orchestra, and he's got the whole score in front of him, so he knows exactly what's happening. And then up here, they are projecting the movie, the cut of the movie with the timing on it, and then you've got all the musicians sitting in front. The job of the conductor is to lead the orchestra and make sure that the music syncs up exactly with the movie. It won't do to have the music, it's going along soft and then gets really loud 2 seconds before the big thing happens on the screen. It has to sync up perfectly with it. Sometimes they discover they don't have enough music and they have to hurry up and write some stuff and rewrite stuff to fill up the missing time. Sometimes they discover they have too much music and they need to do some cuts. So this is all happening very much on the fly, and it's very expensive to rent a big recording studio like this and to have all these musicians and paying all these musicians and the projectionists and all that stuff. It actually costs a lot of money to record the music, so they need to do everything very quickly. The musicians you find in the studios in London, in Los Angeles, and New York are the 3 big hotbeds of movie recording and television recording. They're the best reading musicians anywhere. You can put music in front of them they've never seen before, and they can play it perfectly at first sight in almost every case. Because if you can't, and you have to take more time to rehearse it, well, time is money. Which leads us to John Williams. Excuse me. John Williams from New York City, born on Long Island. He's now in his mid-80s. He's the most famous movie composer that there ever has been. He started out in Hollywood as a piano player, as a jazz piano player. His first job was scoring music for Gilligan's Island. I don't know if you've ever seen that show. It's an old TV show from the 1960s. He's written, oh boy, what hasn't he written? In addition to his movie music, he's written this Olympic fanfare. It was written for the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. You hear, every time you watch the Olympics, you hear John Williams' music being played. He wrote music for President Obama's inauguration. He wrote the theme for NBC News. He wrote a fanfare when they completely renovated the Statue of Liberty in the 1980s, and they had a big celebration opening it up. He wrote the fanfare for that. So, in addition to that, his main job is to write movie music. He's been nominated for an Oscar for original soundtrack 48 times. He's been nominated for 22 Golden Globes and 59 Grammys for Best Original Song in a Movie. What movies has he written music for? Jaws, all of the Star Wars movies. There's this huge list here. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the original Superman movie from the 1980s. Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, all the original Jurassic Parks. Harry Potter, the first Harry Potter movie. Amistad, Saving Private Ryan, War of the Worlds, Munich, 7 Years in Tibet, Catch Me If You Can. My personal favorite John Williams score is the movie Catch Me If You Can, where Leonardo DiCaprio plays a con man. It takes place in the 1960s, and the soundtrack's just fantastic. It's very 1960s cool jazz. It's very different. If you know John Williams' music from, say, Star Wars or E.T. or stuff like that, the soundtrack to this movie, Catch Me If You Can, is very different. So, John Williams has literally written music for hundreds of movies, some of the biggest movies out there. Okay, so that's Chapter 20, music for Broadway and film, stage and screen. So there will be the exam is going to go live. The exam covers world music, jazz, and Broadway and film music. That'll be up. That is going to be due by the start of class on Tuesday, February 26th. And I'll also be providing links to some videos, to YouTube videos that kind of illustrate some stuff that I've been talking